Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome and good evening to Adoption Happy Hour presented by NAAP, the National Association of Adoptees and Parents. Our mission is to unify the adoption community and amplify diverse voices through dialogue, education, connection, and healing. I am Patricia Knight Meyer, and I am here with you on the third Friday happy hour. I'm joined with NAP board member Beth Story. We are delighted to welcome attendees from across the country and around the world. And whether you've been part of this community for years or you're just joining us for the first time, we're grateful you're here. And please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're from. Before we begin our conversation with tonight's guests, we have a few housekeeping things and notes to share. So this is a public meeting with no guarantee that information or identity is confidential. Portions of this event are recorded and may be shared in our private happy hour group on Facebook and on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. Please remain on mute. Raise your hand on screen or the virtual hand to be recognized. You may post your questions or comments in the chat. If you are experiencing a serious mental health event or having suicidal thoughts, please contact a licensed professional or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by dialing 988. Also, if you don't already follow us, our happy hour group on Facebook, please do join us because that's where the replay is going to have. We'll be sharing the replay there, and you can also just from there stay up to date on every new episode that we have coming out. Now, do you have some announcements, Beth?
I do. We want to remind you, or maybe this is an introduction if someone is here for the first time, to all of the programming that NAAP has. Happy Hour, as Patricia mentioned, comes to us twice a month, the first and the third Friday night of each month with a variety of guests. Patricia hosts one of those events each month, and Greg Gentry hosts the other one. And like I said, a variety of topics and guests are brought to us each month that way. We also have Putting Yourself Together After Reunion. Dr. Joyce McGuire-Pavo hosts this support type group. We just met this past Tuesday. She will be back again on April 21st. It's the second or third Tuesday, however Dr. Joyce can fit us into her schedule, but we have a good time with her, and she is so wise when it comes to all of the complexities of reunion, and so we appreciate her being with us. We also have First Families, Birth Parents Journeying Together, and that is facilitated each month by Amy Seek. They will be meeting on April 9th. Coming up, that is the second Thursday of the month, and that group will be coming up. On the 17th, Happy Hour will be back, and then each month we close out with Dr. Liz DeBetta and Migrating Toward Wholeness. They will be here on the 23rd. That group meets the fourth Thursday of each month. Anytime you register for any one of these programs, you will then receive an email invitation the next time one of those programs is hosted. And so you can see that there's something almost every week throughout the month where you can get together with the adoption community.
Yeah.
And that is it for me, Patricia.
Great, thank you. There's definitely a little something for everybody there, that's for sure. So now I am so excited to introduce you to our guest this evening. Our guest is David B. Bohl. David is a clinical substance abuse counselor and master addiction counselor. He is a professional addiction and recovery professional at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation and a former consumer of substance use disorder and mental health services. He is also a writer, a speaker, and the author of Parallel Universes, The Story of Rebirth, a memoir that chronicles the intersection of adoption and addiction in his life. I have read it. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And also, he is the author of Relinquishment and Addiction, What Trauma Has to Do with It, a monograph that provides an overview of the complex issues involved in relinquishment and adoption, and in particular, as they relate to susceptibility to addiction. David has authored part of a core curriculum for clinical settings focused on educating individuals experiencing co-occurring disorders, and he works with individuals experiencing co-occurring substance use disorders and mental health concerns, their families, and those who support them. David lives in southeastern Wisconsin and reaches individuals and families virtually throughout the state. He enjoys time with his wife of 41 years, adult children, and grandchild, and relentlessly pursues Blue Mind, that calm mind state that's found by being in and or around the water. His dedication to the mission of the collective recovery community comes from the fact that although persons in the recovery community often lead similar lives to non-recovering persons, they can experience circumstances needing to be overcome and deserve the resources to do so. David is honored to contribute to such worthy endeavors and remains interested in allying with organizations and professionals who are both dedicated and well-positioned to address these challenges. And he is joining us tonight, and I'm so excited to welcome you. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Patricia. It's my honor to be here. I was trying to recall how many past times I've been on the happy hour. I think at least twice, but it's been since my last visit. So I'm honored that you have me here. And I'm particularly honored to be here on this new platform with you hosting. So thanks for having me.
So welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about a few things tonight. And I think it's really important to preface some of what I'm talking about. Ultimately, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell my story of experience, strength, and hope. I'm going to talk about my struggles with addiction and mental health issues. I'm going to talk about things that happened in my life to allow me to make some changes. And I'm going to talk about what my life is now as a result of making those changes. But I'm also going to talk in depth about why it's important to talk about these things and why it's important for our community to support these types of things. Typically, what I'm talking about tonight is typically only shared in a very few environments, perhaps in Alcoholics Anonymous or other recovery support meeting, or it might be shared in a treatment center or very privately. To hear a testimony that I'm going to be given is often not easily accessible because many of the recovery support groups surrounding individuals who do this are titled anonymous, either Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, something. So it's not always that people who have not experienced some of the things I've experienced are tuned into it. So I'm really honored to be doing that on this platform. And this is the first time I've done this outside of a private environment. So hopefully it will benefit you as much as it has me over time. I want to tell everybody that my name is in fact David B. Bohl, but my original birth certificate reads Baby Boy Bender. Baby Boy Bender. And the irony of a last name of Bender kind of telegraphing what I was going to struggle with through life is not lost on me, and I am able to make light of that today. As you know, and as Patricia described in her outline of what I do, I have lived experience. I'm a relinquishee and I'm an adoptee, and I've been separated from family of origin as having a grandparent MPE. And I work with lots of people who are at that intersection of addiction, mental health, and separation from family of origin. But I'm going to focus mostly on that lived experience tonight and why it's beneficial to share that lived experience. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do so. Thanks, National Association of Adoptees and Parents, and thank you, Beth and Patricia. So to do this, I'm not just going to tell the story. If you want to go see some stories, and they tend to be stigmatized, go watch the movie Wedding Crashers, where the best man gives a toast and he talks about being sober for a short period of time, and there's fun poked at this guy who's got an early period of sobriety. Or go watch the movie Flight, where the main character and his female friend go to an AA meeting, and the person talking, the speaker, is talking about all kinds of ridiculous things that may be funny in a comedy setting, but to those of us who know there's value in telling our stories, kind of cringe when that happens. There are lots of representations in the popular press that don't depict us in the greatest of light, and I'm going to try to share strength as well as challenges going along, because I think it's important to do that. So I'm not only going to tell you what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about it, and I'm going to tell you about it. And I think it's going to be important. Many people think that the why is much more important than the actual what, and it's for you to decide. And I'll let you decide that afterwards. Certainly, here's the what. In 12-step programs in particular, like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, people use the phrase experience, strength, and hope, or the acronym ESH, and it basically describes a specific way members communicate their experiences, right? What happened, what changed, and what it's like today is ultimately the testimony. And that serves any number of purposes, right? So it's not about preaching. It's not about telling people what to do. It's sharing what we're experts on, the wisdom of our own experience, so that we can inspire others with hope that recovery is possible, or family members who may be struggling with a loved one who is struggling with this, right? And it ultimately breaks down that stigma and that isolation of addiction. So when we talk about that experience, right, or what it used to be like, experience is simply that honest, unvarnished history of one's life before and during active addiction. What was that like? How did that affect people's functioning? How did that limit people's ability to be who they wanted to be to themselves and others? And ultimately, what this does is it provides identification and validation, right? When someone new or someone struggling hears someone talking about those feelings of shame and failed promises and hitting rock bottom, they might realize, boy, I thought I was the only one who thought that way or had those experiences. Maybe I'm really not alone. And what it looks like is talking about everything, the messy parts of life and the reality of how addiction affected our mind and our body and our spirits and our relationships. Next comes that strength, or what happened? What happened to get out of that active addiction, right? It's the tools or the new perspectives or the paradigm shifts or the epiphanies that happened that allowed people to make significant changes. As we know, lots of people struggle from addiction. Lots of people don't survive it. So those people who do, if they can tell a story about how they did that, can be really hopeful, right? And ultimately, you're giving people a roadmap. You're telling, this is what works for me. Maybe some of these things can work for you as well. And it's about honesty and humility and telling that story as opposed to sensationalizing it or glorifying the early days or whatever may happen. And then we talk about the hope, right? What are things like now? What evidence do I have that my life is better now that I'm no longer the subject of addiction? And how can I describe that to individuals in generic everyday terms? How is the healing happen and what does that healing look like? Ultimately, doing that provides a lot of information, right? We kind of talk about the thing every human being wants. We want connection. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want self-compassion. We want any number of things, and I'm going to share some of those things as well. Now, the why I talk about this stuff is really important. Not everybody does this, and here's where the stigma comes in, right? The why is about making a distinction ultimately between confession, right, or a really obnoxious public confession that people laugh at, and what I would consider disclosure, right? And disclosure and confession both involve revealing information that was hidden before, but they differ in their intent and their emotional tone and their content. Disclosure's broader, it's more neutral, it's usually factual, but it doesn't inherently carry the guilt or the remorse or the admission of wrongdoing that confession sometimes carries with it. And it's simply about making something known. I'm offered to inform or to seek help or to build understanding or create what I would call a conscious awareness that helps us to stay healthy and strong going forward. So this is a meeting where I'm going to self-disclose some things. I don't believe that they're going to be triggering for most, but these are things that most people do not hear about others and have not heard about me. And I hope that's something that helps you to understand. When I go through the disclosure part, I'm actually finding a key component of people who struggle with addiction, and that is the feelings of shame. It's not unusual for people to feel personal inadequacy when they cannot recover from addiction or when they need help to do that. And people have that inherent shame, and that's something our community really experiences in greater proportions as well, right? The reason I became an alcoholic was because I was inadequate or flawed or bad or broken or defective or all those shameful terms. And the confession is about that. And I'm not confessing that I'm broken or flawed. I'm not quite the opposite. I'm human. And I've had a very fortunate experience that's allowed me to do that. So tonight I'm disclosing, not confessing. Now, disclosure can be done in two different ways. First, I can say something to all of you that I've never spoken or admitted aloud to anyone before, and that can be amazingly empowering. Secondly, it can be a new conscious awareness that I mentioned a moment ago, disclosing things to myself that I didn't have the vocabulary or the capacity to understand before. Like, for example, some childhood adverse experiences or developmental interruptions or trauma that might have caused hypervigilance or an inability to see reality. And that happens a lot in our community, and that happened with me, right? So I'm finding the words that help make sense of my experiences. So we're thinking about what we think, how we feel, our experiences, what was the context around those experiences. Not to confess, but to better understand ourselves and our place in the world. And that's ultimately what experience, strength, and hope is. And it's not healing, it's healing. And through this process comes inner transformation. Inner transformation hopefully makes us a better person to the world, or we're transforming ourselves internally such that our perceptions allow us to do healthy and productive things. Another way to talk about this process of disclosure is what I would describe as chronicling one's cohesive narrative, telling one's articulated, meaningful story of what happened in life, what challenges did we face, what context were there, what re-examination or what reframing of some perspectives did we go to. Because being able to tell that story carries a huge psychological and emotional and relational value through that act of disclosure, especially sharing it with others. And there's lots of science behind this, and I want to talk about that really briefly. Talking about personal experiences, especially when we're able to organize them into a coherent story, helps us process these emotions and reduce that mental burden of those fragmented or chaotic memories or experiences that we didn't have a vocabulary for. There's research on this. James Pennebaker did some pioneering research on expressive writing, for example, that shows that writing about emotional events for short periods of time, 15 to 20 minutes over a few days, can lead to huge improvements in mental and physical health. And the key mechanism there is that narrative formation, taking seemingly overwhelming thoughts and trying to make some sense of them in a cohesive way, right? It might include things like, after examining this or talking to others, I realized that my perceptions were incorrect. Or, boy, I didn't start drinking because I was just destined to be an alcoholic. I started drinking because, and that can be really helpful. That cognitive restructuring, structuring our thoughts. Certainly, Dr. Mary Main of UC Berkeley, decades ago, did lots of research on cohesive narratives, and she found that if a parent, and this is even more so true of a mother, can tell an emotionally coherent narrative about themselves, the greater the chance that their children can do the same. And thus their children will be more emotionally secure. Huge to us parents out there. And cohesive narrative provides purpose to one's life story. Dr. Dan McAdams at Northwestern University has talked about this, and he's talked about people constructing redemptive stories where adversity we experience in life leads to growth, right? Or agency or personal control where we didn't have it before, and ultimately life wisdom. And disclosure is part of that, externalizing the story, allowing for reflection and refinement, right? Putting things into words, making sense of our lives or narrating one's identity. It's a theme in positive psychology. It allows people to experience what would be termed as post-traumatic growth. Those positive outcomes and experiences that might not have been achieved had that stress or that developmental interruption in the case of separation from family of origin never occurred. So in other words, that Friedrich Nietzsche quote, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, can be true in this sense in telling our stories. We can grow from having survived and having made sense of that experience. And of course, many other benefits to disclosure. And I'm going to go briefly over them, right? Health outcomes like reduced anxiety, improving mood, better sleep, lower blood pressure, lowering of trauma and PTSD symptoms directly, because the memories are less fragmented and thus they have less power over the individual experiencing them. This helps relationships when we disclose. It increases closeness and engagement. It synchronizes brain activity between the teller and the listener. We have an intimate experience in the most healthy of ways. And it makes that interaction really compelling and memorable to some people and generalizable to other parts of their lives. And in relationships, this is so huge because we need one of the prescriptions in our community to healing is building intimacy and trust and emotional bonds with others in order to heal together. And the vulnerability in telling one's story and the reciprocity of the shared empathy can be huge and ultimately can be life-changing for many people doing this. And ultimately, as I said, the value lies in this inner transformation, right? The disclosure that turns these isolated, shameful experiences into this narrative that fosters not only self-understanding, but stronger bonds and resilience. And that's what we all need in this day and age that's going increasingly difficult to live in. So I'm going to be talking about that because that's what recovery means to me, right? Inner transformation or identity development or identity expansion, which might be terms some of you in our community are really familiar with. So let me tell my story of experience, strength, and hope. You know what I was going to do, what I'm going to do. You know why I'm going to do it, and that's a really important part. But here's my story, and you can judge whether or not it's useful to you or not. And thank you in advance for allowing this. Having a forum to do this is truly a gift. So I am a person in long-term remission from alcohol. And my sobriety date is August 22nd of 2005. I'm also in remission from nicotine dependence that I had a quit date of June 19, 2009. In addition to that, I'm a relinquishee and I'm an adoptee. And I describe myself this way because that's exactly what happened to me. I was given up and then I was taken in. And some of you may be familiar with adoptee therapist Paul Sunderland. He coined the term relinquishee because, quote, adoption is a word that does not fully describe what's happened to a child. It's a word that works to cover up or deny the wound of relinquishment, end quote. And I found it was very important to include that part of my story. Otherwise, I was not addressing all of the context I needed to do. I learned not too long ago that my genetic heritage is further interrupted by the fact that my genetic grandfather is not the man that my genetic father thought he was. It's somebody else. And my father passed before learning of that. This last discovery has been really shocking, needless to say, to some newly met genetic family members. And they've had lots of big feelings. If anybody knows Ms. Rachel, the kid entertainer and educator, big feelings, right, amongst my relations, including confusion and betrayal and hurt and anger. And I say those things out loud because I know that people in this community can relate to those feelings. I sure can. It's interwoven throughout my story and throughout our community. So as a result, I ultimately identify as having co-occurring disorders. I have an alcohol use disorder concurrent with a developmental trauma or a developmental interruption. And being able to store tell my story is so important for the reasons I talked about before, for all the why, because it's a catalyst for healing. It's been therapeutic. It's allowed me to put together fragmented details and understand things that I never would have understood before or endeavored to jump into before. It's helped me to examine those outdated survival techniques or unhealthy coping mechanisms, and ultimately gives me a sense of control in a world where most of what goes on is beyond my control. I'm empowered as I get to choose what I want to say, what's important for me to say, what I think might be helpful to you, and what might make sense of what happened to me and around me. So it's about self-determination and empowerment. And I'm thrilled, in addition, to be able to hand down my own story that I've seen as something good and honest and empowering to my children and now my grandchild, right? Giving them a connection to their heritage that was interrupted, giving them a stronger, more complete sense of self, something that I didn't have until well into my adult years, and I really had to work hard for it. So working through that fault and shame is really important as well, right? We know that addiction is about 50% genetic, and I've handed this down to my kids and my grandkids now, right? They're now predisposed to addiction. They're also predisposed to a heightened stress response because of the intergenerational trauma that occurs from people being permanently and irreparably disconnected from their family of origin. So these things make me guilty, but I can give them context, I can give them reality, I can give them information that can help them to make healthy decisions for themselves later on. So here's some more of the details. I'm one of 3 children in the family that adopted me. I was the first child. My sister came 2 years after that. She was the miracle baby because she was born to a couple, my adoptive parents, who were diagnosed as being infertile. And my mother, to her ending days in her 90s, would refer to what the doctor told my father. He said, the sperm don't squirm. That was how he diagnosed my father as being infertile. And I learned long after my adopted father passed that he was never the same after hearing that from the doctor. Never the same. I didn't know that, but he lived with that for 53 years. That shame of being infertile in his mind, right? In the rearview mirror, it actually explained some things that I wasn't able to explain about my father and our relationship, but I feel very deeply for him as a result. I had an adopted brother that came from a different family than mine 5 years after that. My brother doesn't talk about his or my adoption. As a matter of fact, he barely could bring himself to read my memoir, and he didn't want to talk about it once he did. And he doesn't want to talk about the family we were adopted into. And you know what? That's okay. That's his story, and I accept that. It's not my place to judge him or shame him by telling him that he owes it to his children to find a medical history that he can pass along to inform their choices. That's on him. That's not on me. Or it's not for me to tell him that he's still in the fog and he hasn't acknowledged that significant loss that he's experienced. Or it's not my role to warn him that if he doesn't investigate these origins and his lack of knowing, it might cause some stress for him in life, right? After all, right, maybe my brother is simply better, well-adjusted than I was. Maybe he's able to say, it is what it is, and I am who I am, and I'm really not affected by it. And maybe, but that's not me. That's not my experience, right? Although I sometimes felt like if I could have just stayed in the fog, life would have been so much easier, but that's not the way it works. So that's my brother's story. I further identify as someone who's part of the search community, like many of you do, because I've been unofficially searching since I was a child. I fantasized that Marilyn Monroe was my mother back in the day. I mean, that's when I started searching or wondering from whom I descended. And I've been formally searching since that time. I've added my name to the National Adoption Registries. I obtained my non-identifying information from the state of Wisconsin. I petitioned the Wisconsin courts for my original birth certificate and actually got not only that, but also my entire adoption file. Be careful what you wish for. There's a lot of information there that I never expected to have, not only about my birth mother, but also about my adopting family. I hired a private detective to help me find family members, and I've connected with many of those family members to date and continue to have good relationships with many of them. And of course, I'm formally investigating DNA links. And again, I'm left with those same feelings that my family had when they were learning things. I'm left with these big feelings. And I think you guys can relate to this. It's sometimes exhausting to envision who all of those family relations are and how I should even feel about them. And, part of me wants to meet some of them or all of them, all these DNA relatives, but another part of me wonders what the hell we have in common other than our DNA. They don't even know that I exist, right? That default voice in my head that I fight a lot says, I don't want to burden them. I don't want to burden them with my need to know. I'd be intruding in their lives if I did that. So I continue to balance that, as I know a lot of us do. One thing I've learned as well is additional knowledge about a family tree does nothing to help me with one of my biggest challenges in life, and that's how to trust people, right? That is a symptom of my experiences of having been relinquished, adopted, and having had traumatic experiences through active addiction, right? And I ask myself to this day, how can I trust the people who maybe cheated relationally with one another, lied or covered up, or never even personally attended to some of their choices or their loss, their grief and pain, or worse, that maybe they knew when they didn't have a conscience and they just were going to take it to the grave with them. I don't want to judge people in that way. In addition, I consider myself or identify as being a secularist or an agnostic and a humanist. It's difficult for me to find the goodness in a superpower or a higher power. It's difficult for me to believe in the goodness of people given my heritage. And that's not because human beings make mistakes or make bad choices. We all do. That's the human condition. It's because many of the people in my life didn't properly deal with those choices or thought they didn't have to deal with those choices and thus ignored them. So lots of turmoil, right? Despite all of that, though, I truly feel like I've been given a gift. I'm proud of my identity as an active member of this adoption community and the recovery community. I'm proud of the work I've done with others. proud of what I've had to do to get here and to be able to talk about this. And I'm really honored to meet and connect with so many others on a similar path like you, who absolutely do show me that human goodness that I crave and seek. So as Patricia mentioned earlier, I've been married to the same amazing woman for 41 years. And it's no small feat for a person who struggles to trust other people. Believe me, this reflects more upon my wife, Vicky, than it does on me. I believe her to be a true angel. And I'm not in the religious sense because I'm not religious, but more so as this amazing source of energy who embodies that goodness that I need in my life, right? She offers comfort. She offers aid in times of trouble. Sadly, she had lots of opportunities to do that early in my addictive career, but thankfully, not at all over the last 20 years of sobriety and health. I also have 2 adult children who are enthusiastically in my life, as are their partners. I became a grandfather for the first time 18 months ago, which, by the way, as many of you may know, has given me lots more opportunity to investigate my story and my identity. I'm really fortunate to live on a lake. Or as Patricia mentioned, I practice Blue Mind, which is ultimately that science that talks about benefiting emotionally and psychologically from water. And it was written and studied by a fellow adoptee by the name of Wallace J. Nichols, who has been on this adoptee happy hour, I believe in early 2021, if you're looking to learn more about that. And I work with people at the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation. So I'll give you the Cliffs Notes, and then I'm going to give you a little more detail. Here's the Cliff Notes, and if that's if you're my age. If you're younger, it's maybe the Blink List or the TLDR version or the Cliff Notes versions or the Chat GPT version. But number one, I suffered a primal wound. I had a separation trauma by being relinquished from my family of origin. 2, I suffered a chronic developmental series of traumas by being adopted and really struggling to attach to the family that I was adopted into. They were lovely people. They did everything they can. I believe that they put everything they could into the relationship, but there are certain things that just could not be employed as a healthy attachment. The agony of both of those things and thinking about them without having any answers or anywhere to go inadvertently but naturally attracted me to alcohol, right? And I used that coping mechanism once I found it obsessively instead of developing healthy coping strategies for living life. I bore witness, direct witness, to the progression of alcohol addiction, and I experienced pain so great that I needed to change or I was going to perish. I mean that literally. I didn't see how that was going to end well for me. I sought help miraculously. How I was able to do that, I don't know, because I couldn't up until that. And once I did, I took responsibility for my choices and I examined my perceptions of the world and I applied healthy health strategies to navigate the world going forward. And I embraced this new expanding identity that develops through taking action to get clear. Now, that's the abridged version. Here's the detailed version, that experience and strength part. Growing up, my head was really active, a really active place for a really long time. I was always critical. My mind was always critical of who I was and what I was thinking and what I was doing. And what my head told me was that I was different and I was defective and I was inadequate. And of course, it literally shouted at me, something is so obviously wrong with you, David, that you better keep it hidden from everybody else. Otherwise, you're going to be a pariah. They're going to shun you. They're going to tease you. They're going to humiliate you. And my brain told me I was unwanted because, after all, I had evidence of that. My genetic parents relinquished me, didn't they? They gave me proof that I was unwanted. I didn't have the story as to why, so that was the assumption. And my brain told me I had no right to feel good about myself because I just didn't have any healthy parts, physical or psychologically. And this was immensely painful. And I could talk hours about this, but I don't want to re-traumatize. And it was a period of intense suffering throughout my formative years. Suffering silently, of course, because I couldn't have explained it even if I were forced to try. I didn't know how to disclose these things or to whom to disclose them. But the anguish is something I wouldn't wish upon anyone. And if you're having that anguish, you can deal with that too. Let's talk about how to do that. But I always felt alone and isolated and not understood. And I thirsted for that connection, yet could never find it. See what I did there, thirsted? Right? If not, you'll see in a moment what I did. Addiction therapist Paul Sunderland again talked about this as a hunger when he said, quote, "The hunger for attachment causes us to put ourselves in harm's way," end quote. That's exactly what I did. I was looking for attachment. So at age 13, this solution miraculously appeared in my life. It landed in my lap. It promised to deliver me from all of that agony. I didn't realize it at first, but I realized it shortly thereafter. And I was sitting in the back of a boat at age 13 on the very lake I live on today, and I was handed a can of Olympia beer. No big deal. I'd had beer before. My adoptive dad gave me sips of his special export, and we always toasted the end of each summer with some Monk David wine on the end of our beer. But I'd never had more than 2 sips or in a row, and I'd never had 2 full beers in a row. And it was that second 12 ounces that opened those heavens for me. And what I would say now in retrospect is I had a spiritual experience. It was synthetically induced. It was naturally induced through alcohol. The alcohol allowed me to feel less uncomfortable, not ultimately comfortable, a lot less uncomfortable in my own skin. And I found that connection. I found this extended family who shared a relationship with this method of feeling okay. And my brain took note of that because that's what addiction does, right? Or I should say, my brain started to wire itself to know how to obtain that feeling of relief over and over again from that day forward, and within 5 to 10 minutes. Because when we ingest alcohol in our bodies, we literally start feeling that inebriation 5 to 10 minutes later. And from then on, my brain repeatedly instructed me to seek that dopamine reward that came with the alcohol. And ultimately, the alcohol changed my reality, and that's what needed to happen. My perception of reality became different. It allowed me to function. It allowed me to live. It allowed me to coexist with that immense self-hatred I had. And I believe to this day, the alcohol saved my life. And this would not be a popular thing to say in recovery circles. I believe the alcohol for a long time saved me from myself, that ruptured, critical, harsh, and incomplete sense of self that existed with me, yet colored my view of everything in the outside world, because it allowed me to move one step forward at a time. But as I became psychologically reliant on this alcohol as a coping mechanism over the years, my body became physiologically dependent on it. And my use went from what I would describe as medicinal to abusive to addictive. And my consumption and negative consequences progressed, as they tend to do for those of us with alcoholism. And that prescription that solved problems in the beginning turned toxic, and it almost killed me. And literally, it almost killed me. Lots of trips to the doctor, 13 different medications by the time I stopped drinking, 2 grand mal seizures as a result of alcohol withdrawal, engaging in dangerous activities, all of those things that almost took me to my grave. And I'm ashamed that it took me so long to get to that point, to recognize that reality. I actually drank for 32 years after I first drank at age 13. But I finally became aware of that obsession that I was pursuing. But again, it wasn't without some very severe and long-lasting consequences. I put my relationships in jeopardy. I wasn't as present for my children as I now wish I would have been. And I was wearing a mask instead of investigating who I was and how to assimilate into this world. I was in desperate disrepair. The 12-step program called this badly mangled. I was so badly mangled that I needed some help to dig out of that mess. And I couldn't do it alone. I mean, for years, I promised my wife that I would quit. And I honestly believed that I meant it when I told her. I don't think I was lying to her. I knew I needed to quit by the time it was time to stop, but I couldn't do it alone, right? So I had to seek some help. And one day I did. Ultimately, and this may seem ironic to you, but here's how it happened. I used to watch the show Intervention that dealt with people with severe addictions and how their loved ones and professionals would get together, have a meeting, help this individual to understand what was going on and to give them the motivation and the opportunity to go seek treatment. And I, of course, would drink Jack Daniels and get drunk while watching the show Intervention, which is the ultimate irony and ultimately an illustration of how dangerous addiction can be. But one night watching the show, I realized, oh my gosh, that's me. And I called the hospital, and the next day I checked into the hospital, and it started out with a medically assisted withdrawal protocol. We call this detox, or used to call this detox. I was detoxified for 3 days in a hospital emergency ward. I was then transferred directly to a residential treatment program where I spent the recommended amount of time. I then followed their recommendations to step down for a 12-week intensive outpatient program. And all the while, I was told to go to meetings, go to recovery support meetings. I attended 450 support meetings in that first 365 days I was sober because I was so badly mangled and didn't know what else to do. I literally was so naive. I thought they were going to strap me to a table when I went to the hospital because I didn't know how they were going to get me to quit drinking. That's how steeped in the alcoholism I was. But this treatment worked. It stopped me from creating additional problems and it stabilized my life. Yet even after being sober for a while, even after things were generally getting better, I still had that pain that I talked about, right? I was still suffering those same feelings of shame and self-hatred that I had before. Now I wasn't making it worse because I wasn't trying to deal with it with an outdated, dangerous coping mechanism, but I still had them. But the difference at this point in my life, as it turned out, was that I was growing more clear-minded, and I got clear enough to start to figure out what was influencing those feelings. And I was finally able to identify what would be called the causes and conditions of my pain. And I've described some of those things to you already. And then one day, boom, it happened. I realized that maybe, just maybe, my relinquishment, my adoption had something to do with all of this. It didn't occur to me when I was going through treatment or detox. And by the way, my neighbor was the emergency room physician in there. If that isn't a humbling experience, I don't know what is. It didn't occur to me when I was going to all those meetings. It didn't occur to me after I took an intensive inventory, after writing for months about my experiences. I actually wrote for almost a year and realized after I completed that writing, I didn't once talk about my adoption or my relinquishment. But now there it was staring me in the face. I had to investigate this. I had to go where I hadn't been able to go before. But the question is how? How do we do that? Well, the Stoic philosophers say, or said back in the day, the obstacle is the way. And at this time, I finally had the presence of mind to stop avoiding that obstacle or going around it. I need to go through it. And it was only then that I was finally able to quantify the problem and address the problems that started all of this in the first place. Those overwhelming feelings of loss and grief that I didn't know were there all along that resulted from my relinquishment, my adoption, that confusion and the identity void I experienced, and trying to figure out how to develop an identity without having information that other people who have identities have, and without adapting or people pleasing or isolating because I didn't know who I was. And I had to address that crisis of low self-esteem and self-confidence and self-loathing that I'd had all along that, that just crushes a person. And I had to learn how to form healthy attachments, not artificial attachments to alcohol that numbed my mind and quieted my mind for a little bit, but healthy attachments with people who could not only accept me and maybe love me if I was lucky, but who would hold me accountable and tell me the truth instead of blowing smoke up my backside and trying to keep me happy. And I did. I got to work. Right? I wrote again for another 6 months. I actually wound up writing for years, and that writing turned into a memoir. But at that time, there weren't really any books or courses or YouTube videos or sponsors or therapists or recovery programs that knew how to do these things. There weren't even recovery support groups, but there are now. So I had to work really hard, but I was able to figure this out. I did do it alone. I did it with a lot of help, not only professional help, but with peer help as well. And in the interest of transparency, it took a long time. But you can do this too. If you haven't done this already, it's doable. And the happy hour is a great place to start and for ongoing support. And lots of other resources too. I can share those off topic or off screen or whenever. Lots of places to go to examine this now. There are more resources today than there have ever been, which means that it's better understood today than it ever has been, these problems. So ultimately what I've done is to stay consciously aware and connect with reality. It's that simple. I have to at least think about my earlier experiences and how I frame them and how my perceptions might have caused me to engage in unhealthy behaviors. I had to replace those obsolete coping mechanisms, drinking, avoidance, isolation, for example, with some healthy ones like connection and self-reflection and daily meditation and mindfulness and grounding and breathing exercises. and I had to attach to some healthy, safe other people. I call this relentlessly pursuing reality. That's my daily philosophy or my recovery program. And ultimately, it's that reality that helps out. Some people might call that reality God or a higher power or the universal mind or whatever works for you. I'm not here to tell you what to do or disavow it in any way, but for me, it's reality. I have to figure out what really exists, not what I fabricated in my mind to backfill a story because I didn't have all the details of my relinquishment and my adoption. And that reality is what helps keep me healthy. Concepts with that reality that are helpful are control, right? I have to know what's in my control and what isn't. Acceptance. I have to see and accept things as they really are, not as I want to fantasize them to be, right? I'm not Marilyn Monroe's son. I've got to deal with that and figure out what happened. And it's about relationality as well, right? I have to connect with protective factors and protective people, right? And through this practice, I've come a long way in my trust, right? When I first started out going to those recovery support meetings, I really struggled with the language of AA and some other 12-step groups because they seemed religious to me, and I didn't understand the language. I later found relinquishment and recovery support groups and started some. And there's an individual who signed up for tonight's meeting who actually runs one professionally and runs one as a peer as well. Much of this has to do with the fact that I have an understanding and empathy for other people. There are I'll tell a brief story. There are two founders of AA, Bill Wilson. He was a co-founder, and Dr. Bob Smith was another one. And Bill W. talked about almost exclusively his alcoholism, but he talked a little bit about depression. But guess what? Bill Wilson was relinquished, right? He was abandoned by his parents and relinquished to the care of his grandparents. His father went to a business convention in New York City and never came home. His mother decided a short time after that she wanted to be an osteopath. So she moved to New York City, enrolled in Cornell Medical School, and never came home again. And I believe that this betrayal that Bill felt, right, was there in the rooms at the very beginning, right? And if he could find some trust and connection even after being rejected, maybe I could. It even got worse. Bill and his wife Lois were diagnosed as being infertile as well. And they went through an adoption agency, and the adoption agency literally told them, you cannot ever adopt a child because, Bill, you are an alcoholic. And I can only imagine the shame that might have caused in him. So learning that context, learning about that truth, and learning about all that trauma in the beginning meant that it's there. We never know what people are walking around with, and it's okay that I've experienced those things and need to deal with them. Doesn't make me weak. I shouldn't feel shameful, right? So that was the shift. That was the change. That was the epiphany, the hope. I don't want to bore you. I don't want to sound arrogant, but I got to tell you, my life is pretty amazing right now. And it's going to be brief in words, but it's boundless in the capacity for self-actualization and connection and peace of mind and hopefully meaning for people that I am fortunate enough to be associated with. And what that means is that my mood and my confidence and my self-esteem and my motivation have improved immensely, so much so that they're no longer damaging my ability to function in relationships and at work and in connecting with that all-powerful universe or reality that I believe in, right? I think more clearly and I make healthier decisions consistently, whereas I didn't have the ability to do that before. I find myself able to reach goals. I don't just stop things and abandon them or get diverted. I follow through, and I take steps to improve my life and the lives of people around me in really intentional ways. And I've connected to and reconnected to family and friends and built some new and healthy relationships, right? I'm able to model healthy behavior for my children and grandson that I never could have done before. And lastly, I get to give back. I get to give back to humanity and the communities that I belong to. And my mantra today is ultimately, in most ways, my life is ideal. In most ways, not always. I am safe, I'm loved, I'm connected. I believe I'm, if not ultimately healthy, I'm healthier in terms of physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. I'm able to add to the lives of others simply by being my true self. And I'm comfortable in my own skin, which to me is the biggest thing of all. I accept and like who I am, something I never thought I could achieve, something as a child growing up, someone going to college, not fitting in. I thought that I was destined never to have that. And I have some really amazing, fascinating people in my life, including all of you, who wouldn't be here if I hadn't had these experiences, and if myself wasn't healthily receptive to others. So now, what does that look like? Well, I also know some family members, some genetic family members. I have phenomenal relationships with a brother and two sisters and their families. We meet regularly, and we've shared information about our family and DNA, and all kinds of things. And it's offered information to me, but also offered me the opportunity to pass along that information in forms of a cohesive narrative. So in the end, I'm trying to downplay this because I know it's not over. Life is something that's to be lived every day. I sure have a long way to go, but in the end, recovery and healing from those co-occurring disorders, the substance use disorder and that relinquishment trauma, is about knowing who I am and not overly having to protect my sense of self, right? And I can't be true to my own self if I don't know who I am. So thanks to all of you for your presence tonight and your support and allowing me to share my experience, strength, and hope with you today. I'm really honored. Thanks.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful and moving and inspiring. We're about to open it up to questions and conversation, but I'm going to end the recording first. So let me do that.